In this video, we discuss client-side input validation. Validating user input on the client side is useful as a client convenience. Whoever is using your web page would appreciate knowing if they typed in a possibly incorrect zip code or they forgot to put in their name. Whatever validation you do on the client side should be repeated on the server side because nothing on the client side is secure. It is trivial to disable JavaScript on the client side. It is trivial to insert your own JavaScript on the client side to possibly do malicious things to the data. So you must assume all your data is dirty and suspicious when it gets to the server side, and that is where you do your reliable data validation. We are focusing on the client side here. Client-side validation will be implemented by the .NET framework using some JavaScript and some HTML5. If you are serving clients who may have a web browser that is not compatible with HTML5, make sure you have your settings adjusted correctly in your .NET Visual Studio project. We will not discuss that here. When we add validation to our form, we connect it to a particular button on the form, and then .NET adds some properties to that button. And I just snipped that here just to show you it might start to look messy to you after a while. Don't worry about interpreting this. We will do our job in Visual Studio, and .NET will generate this for us. Data validation can be performed using regular expressions. Regular expressions are wonderful and awful. They're very useful, and they're also frustrating. They're fun to do, and they will also drive you crazy. You could take easily an entire semester to study regular expressions. There are entire books dedicated to regular expressions. Here is a book that I own called Beginning Regular Expressions. I got it for about $1 at Half Price Books. It's wonderful. It is 768 pages, and it's still called an introductory text. That should tell you something about regular expressions. Should you spend your career studying regular expressions? Probably not. Should you have a very basic understanding of what they do and how to write simple ones? Yes. Should you rely on them to do your job? Probably not, because they are difficult to debug and they change when user requirements change. Am I endorsing that you forget them completely? No. Learn something about them, learn a little bit, learn what the resources are, what websites you can go to validate your expressions, and then be aware that in your back pocket you have some ability to possibly translate and parse them in your head, but don't get knee deep in these things right away. It's just not the right time for it. Let's look at some simple ones. The first one on this slide says that the input string to be validated must start with a capital M followed by exactly 8 digits. The second one says that the user input must start with M followed by 8 digits and must end with M followed by 8 digits. The third one says that the user input must have 5 digits precisely. And hopefully you can match those with things that you know about in the real world. A 5-digit string could be a United States zip code or postal code. An M followed by 8 digits could be the identifying number assigned to you by your beloved university, which we will not mention here, but hopefully it's pretty obvious what that is. There's a website, or there are many websites to validate regular expressions. Let's look at one that I like, regexr.com. I'm going to copy this first regular expression on the slide, capital M \D, curly brace, 8, closing curly brace. I will browse over to the website. The website opens like this, and there is an expression field where you can enter your own regular expression. And what I like about this site is it will parse it for you and give you some semantics. Even if you're not sure what the regular expression does, you can get a pretty good clue by letting this site parse it for you. I'm going to erase what's in the expression field, and notice that there is some syntax that persists. You can't delete the //g. It will always be there. And I will paste in the regular expression from the slide. At the bottom of the screen, it tells you what the M does, it tells you what the \D does, and it tells you what the 8 does in the curly braces. And from that information, you get a better idea of what expressions are being validated here. You can also do a test by clicking the test button, and you can type in what you think is a valid M number, which is capital M followed by 8 digits, and it will give you the passed flag, meaning that what you typed in validates according to that regular expression. We can also type in a little bit of garbage at the end. This regular expression does not require no characters beyond M and 8 digits. In other words, we can tack on things at the end or tack on things at the beginning. I can edit this string again, the test string. I can put an X at the beginning, and this regular expression will still pass because it's matching some subset of the test input. There can be garbage at the beginning, garbage at the end, and it will still match. That means this regular expression is not perfect, but it's a running start against something that we'd like to be able to use. We won't spend too much time on this. If you write a regular expression in the context of this class and it's reasonable, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Here's the slide we saw just a moment ago on our browser. I encourage you to stop the video, take some time, play around with that site a little bit, see if you find a site on your own that you like better, but have something in your bag of tricks that supports regular expressions and know where to go and know how to use it. As you might guess, Visual Studio provides controls to support validation on the client side. There is a control called a regular expression validator, and in this case we are validating according to a regular expression, which is \D, curly brace, 5, close curly brace, and that means that the user input must have 5 consecutive numeric digits, and it will validate. The control that this regular expression validator control will look at and must exist on the form is called TXT zip code, which, as you can imagine, is a zip code that the user would enter. And we can cause multiple validations to take place by assigning them to a group, and then you'll see in a moment we assign that same group to a control that causes a postback, namely a button, and all the validation controls assigned to that group will fire when that button is clicked. Another validation tool is the required field validator, meaning the user just has to type something in. This supersedes the previous control, meaning that we can't leave the control blank if we have a required field validator assigned to that control. Notice in the slides that both validators, both controls, validate the same control on the form TXT zip code. In other words, we can have a required field validator and a regular expression validator assigned to the same control, in this case a zip code. Let's create a new project. So go ahead and create a new project for me. I called mine client-side validation. I added an empty web form, default.aspx. All the project has in it is default.aspx. And I'm going to bring up the toolbox. And I've already opened the validation section of the toolbox. If you get completely lost and you don't know where to go to find these controls, you can simply use the search feature of the toolbox, and if you type in something related to validation controls, it will take you there. The first thing I'm going to do before I even add any validation controls is drop in a text box, and I will call that txt zip code, and I'll leave that alone for now. The second thing I'll do is drop in a button, and I'll call that btn OK, and just change the text of that button to OK. Now I have a field that I can validate, which would ostensibly hold a zip code, and I have a button that will cause a postback, which will cause the validation controls to fire against one or more controls on the form. So let's say right off the bat that this is a required field. You must type in a zip code. We need a required field validator. Let's open up a little space below the button, scroll down in the toolbox to the validation controls, and drag over a required field validator. It's pretty long. I would like it to appear on my screen rather than scrolling off to the right. I am going to simply put in a couple of new line characters. Whoops. And now it appears on the form. So new line characters can break up the tags and the properties of any control on a form actually, but here's a place where it's useful to be able to do that. What should I give it as an ID? RFV is required field validator, and then I will put zip code. So the name of the control is RFV, required field validator, zip code. This is eminently useful to me because the RFV zip code control is now semantically linked to the TXT zip code control. They don't know about each other yet as far as ASP.NET is concerned, but that we know that there is some semantic connection between the two. The other property it gives us that we should probably change right away is the error message, because that is what the user will see. Zip code required might be a good error message text, meaning that if we submit the text box to validation and it fails validation of the required field validator, then the zip code required text will appear on this page of the user, and that's a useful field. So don't leave that to the default, don't blank it out, put something in there that you know the user will read and understand if they make a mistake. We still don't know if this control is a member of a group or not, and I always like to put things into groups. I think that's important. So I could type in the name of the tag and the group, but I'll just use the properties of this control to do that. So I've opened up the Properties tab, and I highlight Required Field Validator, RFV zip code. And I need to look through the properties, and I need to find where I set the validation group for this control. And if you look under Behavior, you'll see a validation group. And again, you can leave it blank, but I don't suggest doing that. So I'm going to say The name of this validation group will be zip code. I haven't created a group with spaces. As you know, spaces are for civilians. It kind of appears that I would be able to do that, but I'm not going to do it. So I don't think that's a good place to put a space. The validation group does not appear to the end user. It's only a programming construct, so we don't have to worry about that name making sense to end users. You can see now I have a text box control called zip code, a required field validator called zip code, and a validation group called zip code. I could make this possibly even better by giving it a prefix. Since it is a named object on my form, maybe VG as a prefix would be better. So let's go with that. Either way, we can make that work. So let's just go with that now. VG zip code for our validation group. We have a validation control. We have a button that doesn't know anything about validation yet. And we have a text box called TXT zip code. Back on the slide, which is slide 8, I immediately noticed that in the example I called my group VG application. I'm going to go back and change that so that it matches the slide. So click on the required field validator and change the validation group to VG application. Now the slide says the required field validator is called zip code. The required field validator on my form is called RFV zip code. Good. Run at server. Every control to this point has always had that. We'll leave that alone. The error message is fine. The validation group matches the slide. The control to validate, which tells this required field validator what control to look at. Do I have that as a property of the validator? I don't. All I have is an ID, an error message, and a validation group. Therefore, this control does not know what to operate on. It doesn't know what field to validate. So again, I can use either hand editing of this XML source code here to add the field to validate, or I can use the properties window of that control. So can you find where in the properties of that control, if you look back on the slide, there should become something called control to validate. Do you see it in the properties of that validator control anywhere? I do. Again, under the behavior tab of the properties for the validator, there is a control to validate. TXT zip code. And then you'll notice that .NET automatically added that tag to the control in our markup. And I'm going to add a new line because it caused it to scroll off the right side of the screen again, and that annoys me. And now I can see what the control to be validated is that validator is assigned to. Am I ready to go? Well, the button still doesn't know what it's doing. Is the button supposed to cause validation? At this point, the button doesn't know to validate anything. Back on the slide, this is slide 9, we add a validation group tag to the button. This is the way we tie a button or an event causing control to the control to be validated. This is the way we tell the button that it needs to process things according to validation on the client side. So I could grab that line of text off my slide and paste it in to the markup in the Visual Studio project, or I can go look at the properties of the button and change it that way too. So let's flip back to the programming again. Let's highlight the button. And let's look for, in the properties of the button, where we set that property. We'll look under behavior of the button. Under behavior of the button, causes validation is set to true. That's a good thing. But what is the validation group? The validation group is blank, certainly because we did not provide one, and there is no default validation group. So the validation group is VG application. When we tab off of that control in the properties tab, that tag is automatically added to the button in the markup. Now the button knows what validation group it is associated with. Cause validation is set to true because that was the default. We're ready to rock then, and let's review this. We have a text box called TXT zip code, which seems harmless, just sitting there in space. We have a required field validator, which knows that it is required to validate that text box because it has a control to validate tag. And it has an error message if something goes wrong in the validation process. So it's ready to go. And we have a button that is tied to a validation group. We have the three parts of the equation. Let's see if it works. Click the run button. Go get a sandwich while it builds. Eventually you get this. We don't have any labels, but we know that this is TXT zip code, and we know that there's our button that will cause a post back. Let's try it with no available, no input in the text box. The text box is blank. Since we cooked up a required field validator to that text box and to that button, we'll see if that actually works. So click on OK. We get an error. I did this on purpose because it's something that I did the first time I learned this, and I did the Googling and I did the research on Stack Overflow, and I will tell you now, to save you the trouble, is you need to add a script resource mapping to your web.config. And that would take you a little bit of research. I'm just saving you the time. So close that browser window. Go back to your project again. Go to the Solution Explorer and open web.config. You can double click on web.config in the Solution Explorer, and you need to add another section to the configuration section. That's that section that you're adding looks like that. Not a big deal once you've researched it. You're setting something called unobtrusive validation mode. I would encourage you to research that and read about it. It's discussed in great detail on Stack Overflow and other places. At this point, I'm just going to tell you to put it in. If you saw that yellow screen of death, then you need to add this section to your web.config. Make the save. Click on the save button. You can close web.config if you like. I don't need to have it open anymore. We can run our project again. Let's see if this works. Our text box is blank. There is no zip code. We click OK. The OK button fired all of the validation controls in that validation group, VG application. And one of those validation controls failed because it realized that the TXT zip code field was empty or blank, and it put up the message zip code required. If you click on the button and you look closely, you'll notice there is no postback taking place. So that validation took place on the client side. It did not cause a postback, and everything happened quickly because there was no round trip necessary. A great convenience for the user, does nothing whatsoever for us on the developer side. We have to validate that input the same way twice, once on the client side for convenience, once on the server side for security. You can close that application. Back to Visual Studio again. Moving on through the slides. In slide 10, here is a more complex regular expression, and it is actually the default regular expression provided by a site called regex buddy. Another thing I encourage you to look at, there's interesting approaches to writing regular expressions on that site, and you will learn a lot from it. I am not going to go into all the details of this regular expression. I'm not going to expect you to be able to write regular expressions. Don't worry. If I need you to do one on an exam, I will give it to you. There is a regular expression validator control that will apply a regular expression to the contents of a control, meaning you can do pretty complex user input validation on the client side. JavaScript actually has a regular expression validator built into it, just like VisualStudio.net does, meaning on both sides of the pond, on the client side and the server side, you can apply regular expressions to validate data. So keep that in your back pocket. It's a good tool to know about. Another project that I made available to you on your LMS is called Job App Incomplete. It contains several to-do comments, which what you will do then is to implement those to-dos and remove the to-do comments, and then you will submit that. There are to-do comments in the the XML markup, as well as in the C# code. So once you're done with editing default.aspx and fulfilling all the to-dos, don't forget to go back to the C# code and do the same thing. You have two separate jobs to do there. Here is the Job App Incomplete project. You should download this from the LMS and load it. This is what you will do to it. I would say very first thing right off the bat, I added a comment. Notice that you will edit the web.config in this project. I didn't do it for you, just to get you used to doing that. So put that in the web.config the same way I did a few minutes ago in this presentation. And then start looking for to-dos. Here's a to-do on a text box called last name, indicating that you must add a required field validator to that text box. We can't validate a last name to a great extent because there are so many different last names, but we can require a user to type in something. At least we can prevent him from skipping that field altogether. Here's another text box called first name. You'll add a required field validator to that one, and so on. Notice that there are quite a few of them here, but once you get the first one done, it's pretty straightforward. Here's one that requires a regular expression application, and I gave you that regular expression. So you can just copy the regular expression right off of the slides to implement this date of birth validator. I don't know what that 0 is doing there. You probably don't need that. Once you've got all of those done, then connect the validation group that you created to that button, and that button will cause a postback if all the validation controls in that validation group return no problem. Don't forget the validation group. You'll go to all this hard work, but you won't have a validation group, and the button won't know what group to validate, and your controls won't know what group they're in, and the validation controls won't know what group they are in. Don't forget the validation group. That should give you plenty to do. Jump in after you've studied the slides and watched the video 3 or 4 or 5 more times and voted it up and subscribed to my channel and all those things that YouTubers ask you to do. You're ready to roll. Thank you.